It was mid-January, and the snowstorm was relentless. My girlfriend, Mia, and I were staying at her parents' mountain home, a quiet retreat buried under feet of snow. That night, as we watched movies by the fire, Mia realized her car was parked on the road and needed to be moved before it got buried. Bundling up, we trudged through the snow to her car. The wind howled, and the road was barely visible beneath the thick blanket of white. As we cleared her windshield, the rumble of an engine broke through the storm. Headlights appeared, a snowplow, crawling up the road toward us. At first, we were relieved, but as the plow drew closer, something felt off. The truck was old and rusted, its headlights dim and flickering. When it stopped, the driver, a scruffy, hollow-eyed man, rolled down the window. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice rough. "We're just moving the car," Mia replied. The driver stared at us for a long moment before nodding. "Storms like this, they can turn on you." Without another word, he drove off, his taillights disappearing into the snow. Back inside, I couldn't shake the unease. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of an engine outside. Peering out the window, I saw the same rusted plow idling in front of the house. "Mia," I whispered, shaking her awake. The driver stepped out, but he wasn't alone. Another man joined him, both carrying shovels. They walked to Mia's car. One raised his shovel and smashed the driver's side window. "What are they doing?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. Grabbing the fire poker, I motioned for her to stay back. The men turned toward the house. Moments later, the porch light flickered out, plunging us into darkness. The front door rattled, then a heavy knock echoed through the house. My heart pounded as I stood frozen, gripping the poker. "Who's there?" I called out. No answer. The banging grew louder before it abruptly stopped. Silence returned, but I didn't dare move. When I finally peeked out the window, the plow and the men were gone. Outside, Mia's car was a wreck, windows smashed, tires slashed. The police arrived an hour later, but didn't seem convinced by my story. "Not many trucks like that around here," one officer said. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. By morning, the storm had cleared, but the eerie feeling lingered. Even now, I can't see a snowplow without remembering those men and the sound of that engine in the storm. Sometimes, I wonder if they were real, or if the storm had turned on us after all. Last winter, I worked as a rideshare driver to make extra money for the holidays. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. Most nights were uneventful, just ferrying people home from work or parties. But one night, I picked up a passenger I'll never forget. It was snowing heavily, and the roads were a mess. My app pinged, and the pickup location was on the outskirts of town near an old, abandoned industrial area. I almost ignored it. Rides in that part of town were rare and usually trouble, but I needed the money, so I accepted. When I pulled up to the pin on the map, I saw a man standing by the side of the road. He was wearing a long, dark coat and no hat, despite the freezing wind. His face was pale, and his breath clouded the air in front of him. Something about him made me uneasy, but I rolled down the window anyway. "Are you John?" I asked, confirming the name on the app. He nodded and climbed into the backseat without saying a word. The moment he shut the door, a chill swept through the car. I turned up the heat, but it didn't seem to help. The destination on the app was an address in the middle of nowhere, just a stretch of road that led out of town. I tried to make small talk to ease the tension. "Cold night, huh?" I said, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. He didn't respond. He just stared out the window, his face unreadable. His silence put me on edge, but I focused on the road, reminding myself that not every passenger wanted to chat. As we drove, the snowstorm worsened. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up, and visibility was terrible. The man in the back seat didn't seem to notice or care. He just sat there, motionless. About 10 minutes into the drive, I glanced in the rearview mirror again and froze. The seatbelt across his chest was covered in frost. I thought it was a trick of the light, but when I looked closer, I saw tiny ice crystals clinging to his coat and the seat around him. It didn't make sense. The heat in the car was blasting, and I was sweating in my jacket. My unease grew, but I didn't dare stop. The road ahead was desolate, lined with snow-covered trees. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Hey, is this really where you're going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's nothing out here." He didn't answer, but for the first time, he turned to look at me. His eyes were a pale, milky blue, so pale they didn't even look human. My stomach dropped, and I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Stop the car," he said, his voice low and hollow. I hesitated, but something in his tone made it clear I didn't have a choice. I pulled over to the side of the road, the tires crunching in the snow. He opened the door and stepped out without another word. I sat there, watching as he walked toward the trees. The snow swallowed him up almost immediately, but I could still see faint footprints in the drifts. Then suddenly, the footprints stopped. They didn't fade, they just ended, as if he'd vanished into thin air. I didn't stick around to investigate. My hands were shaking as I pulled back onto the road and drove as fast as the snow would allow. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him sitting there again. But the back seat was empty. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about him. I looked up the address from the ride, but it didn't exist. The app had no record of the trip, and when I checked my car the next morning, the back seat was still covered in frost. I stopped driving at night after that. Some fares just aren't worth the money. Last winter, my girlfriend Sarah and I decided to go snowshoeing in the national forest near her parents' cabin. It was supposed to be a simple, romantic afternoon, just the two of us and miles of fresh snow. The sky was clear, and the forest was eerily quiet, the way it gets after a heavy snowfall. We had been hiking for about an hour when we came across a narrow trail that wasn't on the map. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, with snow piling up unevenly on the ground. Sarah, always the adventurous one, suggested we follow it. "Just for a little while," she said. "Maybe it leads to something cool." I hesitated, but eventually agreed. The trail wound deeper into the woods, the trees growing thicker and the sunlight dimming. After about 20 minutes, we came to a small clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated wooden cabin, half buried in snow. It looked ancient, the roof sagging under the weight of ice, the windows shattered. "This is awesome," Sarah whispered, pulling out her phone to take pictures. "It's like something out of a horror movie." "Yeah, no kidding," I muttered. I didn't like the cabin. Something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong there. But Sarah was already walking toward it. As we got closer, I noticed strange symbols carved into the wood around the doorframe. They didn't look like graffiti, more like some kind of ritual markings. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, but I didn't say anything. Sarah pushed open the door, and it creaked loudly, echoing through the forest. Inside, the air was colder than outside, and the smell of damp wood and decay hit me immediately. The interior was empty except for a broken chair, a rotting table, and what looked like claw marks gouged into the walls. Sarah walked around, snapping pictures and laughing about how creepy it was. I stayed near the door, feeling like we were intruding on something. Then Sarah found the trapdoor. It was in the corner of the cabin, partially hidden under a tattered rug. She knelt down and pulled it open, revealing a set of narrow stairs leading into darkness. A cold draft wafted up, carrying a faint, metallic smell. "No way," I said firmly. "We're not going down there." "Come on," Sarah said, grinning. "Don't you want to see what's down there? It's probably just a root cellar." "Exactly," I replied. and I don't want to find out what's in it." For once, she listened. She closed the trapdoor, and we left the cabin. But as we walked back to the main trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder, sure I'd see someone or something following us, but the forest was empty. We didn't talk much on the way back. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was setting, and the temperature had dropped. As we loaded our gear into the car, Sarah pulled out her phone to look at the pictures she'd taken. Her face went pale. "What's wrong?" I asked. She handed me the phone without saying a word. I scrolled through the pictures, my stomach tightening with each one. At first, they were normal. Shots of the snowy trail, the clearing, and the cabin. But in one photo, taken inside the cabin, there was something in the background. A figure. It was barely visible, standing near the trapdoor. It looked like a man, but his face was too pale, and his eyes were sunk in black pits. He was staring directly at the camera. "We need to go," I said, my voice shaking. We drove back to the cabin in silence, locking the doors and double-checking the windows. That night, neither of us could sleep. Around 3, we heard a faint knock at the front door. We didn't answer. Last January, I was driving home from visiting my parents in a small town upstate. The forecast had predicted snow, but it wasn't supposed to get heavy until later in the evening. I figured I had enough time to make the 3-hour drive back to my apartment before the storm hit. About halfway into the trip, the snow started falling harder than expected. Visibility was getting worse, and the main road was already slick with ice. My car's tires slipped a few times, and I realized I needed to find a safer route. That's when I saw a sign for a side road that claimed to be a shortcut to the highway. I didn't recognize it, but the idea of getting back to a well-maintained highway sooner was appealing. Big mistake? The road was narrow and winding, cutting through dense woods. As the snow thickened, it became harder to tell where the edges of the road were. There were no streetlights, and the trees loomed over me like dark shadows. My phone had no signal, so I couldn't check my GPS. I told myself to stay calm. It was just a back road, and eventually I'd reach the highway. But the farther I drove, the worse it got. The snow was falling so fast that it was piling up on the road, and my car's tires were struggling to grip. I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Panic started to creep in when I realized I hadn't seen another car or house in over 20 minutes. Then, out of nowhere, my headlights illuminated something in the road, a figure. I slammed on the brakes, and my car skidded to a stop. Standing in the middle of the snowy road was a woman. She wasn't wearing a coat, just a thin dress that looked soaked through. Her hair was plastered to her face, and her arms were wrapped around herself like she was freezing. I rolled down my window just enough to call out, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't answer. She just stood there, shivering, her back slightly hunched like she was in pain. Something about her posture made my stomach twist. I considered getting out to check on her, but the storm was brutal, and something about the situation didn't feel right. I kept my hand on the gear shift, ready to drive away. "Do you need a ride?" I tried again, louder this time. Finally, she looked up. Her face was pale, her lips almost blue, but it was her eyes that froze me. They were wide and filled with something I can only describe as terror. She opened her mouth like she was trying to speak, but no sound came out. Before I could react, she turned and stumbled off the road into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I sat there for a moment, debating whether to follow her or keep driving. Every instinct told me to leave, but I couldn't just abandon someone in a snowstorm. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out into the cold. The wind was brutal, whipping snow into my face as I called out, "Hello? Are you okay?" No answer. I walked to where she'd entered the woods, The snow was already filling in her footprints, but I could see enough to follow. They led about 20 feet into the trees before abruptly stopping. There were no other tracks, no sign of her turning back or continuing deeper into the woods. Just nothing. A wave of dread washed over me. I shone my flashlight around, half expecting to see her standing nearby, but there was no one there. The only sound was the wind howling through the trees. I ran back to my car, my heart pounding. As soon as I was inside, I locked the doors and started driving, not caring how slick the road was. I just wanted to get out of there. Eventually, the shortcut spit me back onto the highway. I didn't stop until I reached my apartment. Hours later, that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the woman, about how scared she looked, and about how her footprints just ended. I checked the news the next day, but there were no reports of anyone missing in the area. To this day, I don't know who or what I saw on that road. All I know is that I'll never take a shortcut in a snowstorm again. Last winter, my friend Eric invited me to go ice fishing with him on a remote lake up north. He'd been doing it for years, swearing it was the most peaceful thing in the world. I'd never been before, but I thought, why not? A weekend away from the city sounded perfect. We drove up early Saturday morning, and by noon, we were out on the lake. The snow-covered expanse stretched out for miles, with nothing but a few distant shacks dotting the ice. It was quiet, eerily quiet, except for the occasional groan of the ice beneath us. Eric assured me it was normal, but I couldn't help feeling uneasy. We set up near the middle of the lake, drilling a hole in the ice and dropping our lines in. The air was bitterly cold, but the small propane heater Eric brought kept the chill at bay. For the first few hours, it was exactly as Eric had promised, peaceful. We talked, joked around, and waited for a bite. Around 4 p.m., as the sun started to dip, Eric decided to check out a nearby fishing hole someone else had abandoned earlier. He told me to stay put and keep an eye on our lines. I watched as he trudged off across the ice, his figure growing smaller until he disappeared behind a distant snowbank. That's when things started to feel off. The wind picked up, whistling across the ice and making the shack creak. The groaning of the lake seemed louder now, almost rhythmic, like something was shifting below. I told myself it was just the natural movement of the ice, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then I saw it. About 50 yards away, there was a man standing on the ice. He wasn't dressed for the weather, just a thin jacket, no gloves or hat. His back was to me, and he stood completely still, staring down into a hole in the ice. At first, I thought maybe it was another fisherman. Maybe he had gotten separated from his group. I called out, "Hey, you okay?" He didn't respond. I called again, louder this time, but he still didn't move. Unease prickled at the back of my neck. Something about the way he stood, so rigid, so unnatural, didn't sit right. I grabbed my phone to call Eric, but of course, there was no signal out here. When I looked back, the man was gone. I froze, scanning the ice. There was no way he could have just disappeared. The ice was flat and open for miles. There was nowhere to hide. I stood there, heart pounding, until I saw Eric making his way back. I ran out to meet him, stumbling over my words as I tried to explain what I'd seen. Eric looked at me like I was crazy. "There's no one else out here," he said. I didn't see anyone. I insisted, dragging him to the spot where I'd seen the man. When we got there was nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. Just the hole in the ice, now partially frozen over. Eric tried to laugh it off, saying I must have imagined it. But I knew what I saw. We packed up quickly and left before the sun fully set. As we drove back to the cabin, Eric told me an old local story he'd heard growing up. Decades ago, a fisherman had fallen through the ice on that very lake. His body was never recovered, and some people claimed his spirit still wandered the ice. searching for his lost gear. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I haven't gone ice fishing since. Whatever I saw out there that day, it wasn't normal, and it sure as hell wasn't peaceful. Last December, my boyfriend Mark and I rented a small cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway. We'd found it on a rental site, advertised as secluded and perfect for a quiet winter retreat. The pictures showed a charming, snow-covered cottage surrounded by dense forest, and it seemed ideal for us. When we arrived, the cabin looked exactly as advertised, small, cozy, and tucked away from the rest of the world. The owner had left the key in a lockbox on the porch, just as instructed in the email. The snow was falling lightly, and everything felt calm. Perfect. The first night passed uneventfully. We cooked dinner, played board games, and sat by the fire, enjoying the peace and quiet. It wasn't until the next morning that things started to feel strange. Mark went outside to grab more firewood from the shed, and when he came back, he looked confused. "Did you lock the door earlier?" he asked. "No," I said, puzzled. "Why?" "The lockbox is open, and the key is gone." I frowned, certain we'd put the key back in the box after unlocking the cabin. I went outside to check, and sure enough, the lockbox was hanging open, the key missing. Fresh footprints in the snow led away from the porch and into the woods. They were deep, suggesting someone had been there recently. "Maybe it was an animal," I said, though I knew how ridiculous that sounded. Animals don't take keys. Mark wasn't convinced, but he tried to brush it off. "Probably just a neighbor messing around," he said. Let's not overthink it. We spent the rest of the day inside, but the relaxed atmosphere we'd come for was gone. Every so often, I caught Mark glancing out the window toward the woods. I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. The cabin was supposed to be secluded. Who would have come all the way out here just to take a key? That night, the wind picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the windows. Mark and I were lying in bed when we heard it, a faint tapping on the front door. We froze. The tapping came again, louder this time. "Maybe it's the wind," Mark whispered, though his face said he didn't believe it. He got out of bed and grabbed the fireplace poker, motioning for me to stay put. I followed anyway, clutching my phone. We crept to the front door, and Mark peeked through the peephole. "There's no one there," he said. He opened the door just a crack, and the icy wind rushed in. The porch was empty, but there was something on the mat. It was the key. Mark slammed the door and locked it. Neither of us slept that night. Every creak of the cabin and whistle of the wind made my heart race. I kept imagining someone out there, just beyond the tree line, watching. When morning finally came, we packed up and left as quickly as we could. As we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw him. A man was standing at the edge of the woods, half hidden by the trees. He wore a heavy coat, his face obscured by a hood, and he didn't move as we sped down the snowy road. We reported the incident to the rental company, but they brushed it off, saying it was likely just a local messing with tourists. But I know what I saw. That man wasn't some prankster. I don't know who he was or why he left the key, but the thought of him watching us, just waiting outside, still sends shivers down my spine.